Hello everyone, and welcome to the PASS Preview Edition 24 Hours of PASS presentation, Everything You Never Wanted to Know About Extended Events, by Jonathan Kehayias and Erin Stellato. I'm Mindy Cornett. I'm going to be the moderator for this presentation. Next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with the GoToWebinar interface, if you require any assistance during the session, you can type your question in the pane over to the right-hand side. There's an area for you to write a question down. I'll be able to see those questions. We're going to try to keep the questions, unless they're very, very simple and can be answered via text, we're going to try to keep them all to the end. So don't feel like we're ignoring you if you don't get your question answered immediately. Try maximizing your screen for a better experience during this. And again, I don't know why we have the questions on the right-hand side again, but you kind of get the idea there. Next slide. We want to thank our sponsors today for the 24 Hours of PASS, Microsoft and Dell Software. Without them, we wouldn't be able to put this on for all of you. And next. If you're planning on attending a PASS, I'm going to be excited to see you there. It's November 4th through 7th in Seattle this year. And the URL is sqlpass.org/summit. You can use a 24HOP14 code to save $200 at this point. It's still $1,895 until September 26th. Next slide. So for our two speakers today, Erin Stellato is a principal consultant with SQL Skills. She has 12 years of experience working with SQL, has worked with SQL Server since 2003, and she is currently an MVP with Microsoft for SQL Server. Jonathan is an MCM for SQL Server 2008. That's a certified master. He's also a SQL MVP, senior consultant with SQL Skills. And so both these two people, if you're not aware of who they are, they're got pretty big heavyweights in the SQL community. So we're really excited to have them speaking for us today. And with that, we're ready to start.
All right, thank you, Mindy. Hello, everyone. My name is Erin Stellato, and Jonathan is also on the line here. He's probably just lurking in the background. He might hop in every once in a while to say hi. But this is our session, Everything You Never Wanted to Know About Extended Events. And this is a preview of our pre-con that we're going to have at Summit. And a little bit of additional information about us. I'm not going to read through these slides. The most important thing on each of these slides, on Jonathan's and mine, which is next, is our email addresses. We'll do our best to get through all your questions at the end, but if we don't get them answered, feel free to email us. Jonathan's email is jonathan@sqlskills.com. I'm more into pictures, as you can see, and mine is erin@sqlskills.com. Here's the abstract from the session. I put this in here just to set the stage, to set expectations, because, again, we've got 45 minutes to get through a lot of information that we're going to spend 8 hours covering in our pre-con. So what we're doing today is just highlighting some selected use cases for extended events. And if you come to the pre-con, again, we're doing a deep dive from beginning to end that goes through and answers all the questions you've got about extended events. And I want to start with a quick comparison between Trace and extended events. And I'm assuming that a lot of you have been using Trace. It's been available since SQL Server 7, right? So it's functionality that we've been using for many, many years. And you'll hear me say Trace and Profiler, but for SQL Server 2008 and higher, you've only got 180 different events within Trace. And in SQL Server 2014, you've got over 870 events, right? Way more. And if that doesn't get you thinking about extended events already, hold tight because I've got some more. Trace allows you to display information in the UI or write it out to a file. You can do the exact same thing with extended events. In Trace, you can filter on reads and duration and CPU. You can do all of that in extended events. And you also have the ability to do and or when you're doing your filtering. And you also have short circuit evaluation, which is huge when troubleshooting. You can do data analysis with Trace using third-party tools. And if you're running SQL Server 2008 R2 and below, and you're still using Trace, these tools are free and they're incredibly valuable. So I definitely recommend checking them out if you haven't been using them. Recently, the ability to do analysis of extended events output was made available in Read Trace. So this has happened within the last few months. So in addition to the UI, which is what we're going to do today, we also have a third-party tool available now. And some additional points about extended events, which hopefully sway you to start using this. There are significantly more options for troubleshooting with extended events, and it is the only method for troubleshooting new functionality. So if you attended Kaylin's session earlier about in-memory OLTP or Alan Hurt's session about availability groups, if you want to troubleshoot either one of those, you've got to use extended events. So when we think about what we typically would do with Trace, right, we would take a representative workload from your system, and we would capture it for a particular amount of time, and maybe we'd be looking for high resource queries, or we'd be looking for those that run most often, right? We call that death by 1,000 cuts. And we'd capture information like the text data, the duration, the reads, application name. And then for analysis, some of you might take that data and push it into a table, which you could then order the queries by I/O, or you could try and do some aggregation on the text data. But that was kind of tricky if you had different literal values. You had to get a little bit creative. And that's where those third-party tools come in, like ClearTrace and Retrace and Cure, because they normalize that data and then allow you to easily find that death by 1,000 cuts. We really want to be able to do the same thing in extended events, and that's a really good starting point, I think, for people to learn extended events. What did you used to do in Trace? What do you want to do now in extended events? That exact same thing. So today we're going to create an extended event session that captures the same things you used to in Trace, but we're going to also capture query hash, and for fun we're going to capture query plan hash. And this is information that was made available in SQL 2008, and if you're not familiar with these, there's a post by Bart Duncan which does a nice job explaining them. It's pretty old but very useful. And that query hash is a unique ID for each query, and you'll sometimes hear that called the query fingerprint. And it's independent of those inline parameter values, so it's a really great way to find the queries that are exactly the same. And you can do this in the DMVs, but we can also do that with extended events, which allows us to capture over an extended amount of time. And then what we can do is use the UI for that analysis on that query hash, and we can also actually do a lot more with that than we ever could within Profiler. A couple differences I want to point out before we hop into our demo, because demos are the best way, I think, to see and to learn, and so that's what we're going to hop right to immediately. There isn't a one-to-one relationship between the information that you would get by an event in Trace and what you would see in extended events. And I'll point that out when we get there. But like, for example, the SP statement completed event in Trace captured certain information, and it doesn't capture that same information by default in extended events. But we can get there using actions. So let's hop into this demo. And we've got Management Studio, and we're running SQL Server 2014 CU3, which is the most recent cumulative update released last month. And within my instance here, you can see that I've got a couple databases. I've got the AdventureWorks 2014 database, and this is actually the 2014 version, not a 2012 upgraded, but the 2014 version. And I'm going to expand management, and underneath here you can see extended events. And then you can see we've got sessions. And there are going to be 2 sessions if you're running 2012 and higher, and you've got the UI here. And by the way, this UI is only in SQL Server 2012 and higher. Extended events came into being in SQL Server 2008. And it's also in 2008 R2, but this UI is only going to appear for those of you running 2012. And if you connect back to 2008 or 2008 R2, you won't have that same option. It's only for a 2012 and higher installation. So within my sessions, I've got the system health, which Jonathan is going to talk more about when he takes over, and we also have always on health. So if I were using availability groups, this would be enabled. You can see that I've got the red down arrow. It's not in use, but system health is always there and running. It's analogous to the default Trace, but not exactly the same. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a new user extended event session. So I can click on sessions, right click, and I've got new session wizard and I've got new session. I tend to avoid the wizard. It doesn't give me all the same options that I get through New Session. So we'll click New Session. And within here, I'm going to enter the session name. And this is just going to be Capture Workload. And you'll notice that I've got template, which I used to have templates in Trace. I've got that same thing right here in Extended Events, and I can also customize them just as I could within Profiler. I've got a couple options down below. One of them I just want to point out is the option to start the event session at server startup. I can have an extended event session that automatically starts every time the instance starts. We don't have to do it with a job like we did before, which is pretty nice functionality. I'm going to go to the events page, and on the left here, I've got all the different events that are available to me, right? All 870 of them. And one thing I want to point out is that underneath channel, the events are broken out by these different channels: admin, analytic, debug, and operational. And you'll see that debug is not selected by default. And so if you want to make sure you're seeing all of them, hop in here and select debug so you get the entire list. And one of my favorite things about this UI in Extended Events is that I can search. Right? If we hop over to Profiler really quick, and I'm not going to flip back and forth. This is the one time I'm going to go to Profiler. And if you've got two screens, it might be really nice for you to run Profiler on your other screen. So you could walk through it side by side. But if I'm in Profiler, if you remember when you would go in here to select the events, right, and you would be looking for something, how much would you be scrolling up and down and looking for what you wanted? Right? I lost hours of time doing that. In Extended Events, let's flip back here. Right? Within this window here, if I'm looking for statement completed, I can just type statement. And it gives me the events that include that text. So this is one of these great little features that I love. And we're going to select for our events SP statement completed. And we're also, I'm going to hold down the control key and select SQL statement completed. So I've highlighted these two events, and I'm going to click the arrow in the middle to push those over to my selected events here. So these are the two events that I'm going to capture for our demo today. Now, there wasn't enough real estate to show everything related to these events, so we've got this configure button right up here that I'm going to click on. And when I click on configure, you're going to get a sound effect here, right, from me. It goes whoop, and now we see the information related to the specific events. If I want to go back and select more events, I click the select button, whoop, it flips back. Okay. So we've got our two selected events, SP statement completed, and we've got SQL statement completed. Now we've got three different tabs over here on the right: global fields, filter, and event fields. And I'm going to actually start with the farthest one over here. I'm going to start with event fields. I mentioned that the columns that you captured in Trace, there's not a one-to-one relationship between events over to Extended Events. And what I mean is, I lied. I'm going to go back to Profiler real quick. If I come under here under Stored Procedures and I look at SP statement completed, I had all of these columns that were available to me, and I can unselect which ones I don't want. It's a little bit different in Extended Events. What I have over here is I've got SP statement completed, and these event fields, this is what we call the default payload. This information you're getting by default, I can't unselect it. My exceptions are statement. I could uncheck this box and say I don't want statement, but a lot of times I do, and it's included by default. I could add object name if I wanted, but duration, logical reads, object ID, all of this is being collected by default. It's the default payload, and it's different per event, right? If I look at SP statement completed versus SQL statement completed, I have a different set of information that's collected. Now, to make this look like what I would get in Trace, if I had additional columns that I captured, we go over to actions. So under global fields or actions, these are additional pieces of information that I can capture. And I can highlight both SQL statement completed, and I can do control, and I can click on SP statement completed. And now under global fields, I could add client app name, and we want to add, as I mentioned, we were going to do query hash, and also just for fun, query plan hash. Now you see there's a lot of different columns here. I can add a lot of different actions, but there's overhead associated with that. So if again, I've got my default payload under event fields, and then I can add more actions, but the more actions I'm adding, the more overhead, and some of them add more than others. The last thing that I want to point out in this window is my filter. Now, we're not going to add a filter today, but typically when you're running a trace or an extended events session against your production workload, you want to filter on something, right? You don't want to bring down that system. Not saying anybody's ever done that, but we don't want to do that. So what you can do is in your field, we could drop down and we could say, well, I only want to look for queries with logical reads greater than 10,000. And so I've added a predicate here, right? I've added a filter. And I mentioned, I'm just going to show this really quick, that I can also say I only want something that's got writes greater than 1,000. And I have, again, I'm going to zoom in here. With this logical reads, I have this and or logic. So right now I'm saying and, right? Only give me queries with logical reads greater than 10,000 and writes greater than 1,000. But I can change this, right? So pretty cool. Again, we're not going to go into this today, but I like mentioning it because it's something that we'll talk about in more detail in our pre-con. So I don't have a filter. I've got my default payload for both of my events, and I've got some additional actions here. Last thing I'm going to set up is my storage. And you will hear John and I often say the target. Where am I pushing this information? What's my target? And we're going to stay consistent with what we would do in Trace, and we're going to write it out to a file. So we've got an event file, and let's browse out and put this just in my C temp folder and give it a name. And just like with Trace, I can configure a file size. Default is 1 gig. I can enable rollover, and I can specify the max number of files. And I'm not going to go into the advanced pane today. We're just going to go ahead and select OK. And now you'll see under sessions, I have this extended event session. And I can create multiple sessions, and they can be active, inactive, independently. I'm going to go ahead and start this. And I have the ability to do this with a right-click Start Session, or I do have a script that will be available, that will be available to you. And it includes the T-SQL for what we've done. So this is the T-SQL to create the event. And I have the ability to start it with an alter event session. Or again, I can just right-click and select Start Session. That's rolling. Let's run my workload here. So I've just got a bunch of PowerShell scripts that are going to run bunches of queries against my system. And I didn't get that before in all my practices. Let's make sure these are all running. This is the fun of demos, right? Excellent. Now, I've got this going. This is writing out to my file. If I go out to my temp location, you'll see I've got a file here. And one of the nice things about extended events is it appends all these numbers to the end of it, which make each file you generate unique. Fantastic feature. This is running, and if I want to look at this live, I'm going to go ahead and right-click and watch live data. So just like I could with Profiler, where I could watch live data, which wasn't a good thing because of the performance implication, I can watch live data in extended events. And so what I'm seeing now is a subset of what's been occurring, right? Because the session's been started, I'm turning on live data now, and you'll see that it's pushing information, it's pushing the events to this UI over time. So this display is changing from, right now it's at 6,000 events. This will update to 8,000. So at any point I can stop, just stop the feed, stop collecting that information. So again, in your environment, you would set up this extended event session, you would let it run. When we're finished, we'll go ahead and stop it, right-click Stop Session, or again, you've got T-SQL, which can do that, which you could put in a job, have it stop automatically. So we finished. Now, I could do some analysis of this data right here, of this sample that I captured, or I can go out to this XEL file, and I can just pull this into Management Studio, and I can do the analysis right here. So in total, we captured about 43,000 events. Right? My sample here was 10,000. So we'll work with our 43,000. And I know that when you look at this window right here, you're like, hey, that doesn't look very interesting, right? Profiler gave me a much better view. By default, when you open this file, you're only going to see these two columns, name and timestamp, because these two columns are consistent across every event. If I want to view additional information that I captured, I can just highlight one of these, and let's say I want to add logical reads. So I can right-click, show column and table, logical reads pops up there. If I care about duration, I can add that as well. And I have the ability to do this from the menu as well. I've got choose columns up here at the top, I can click on Choose Columns, and let's add the whole thing we were capturing from the beginning, query hash, and we'll also add statement. So now we have this information. And by the way, I can save this layout. You've got a display settings. I can save this so that every time I open a file, I can come back and see the same view. You also have the ability to sort. If I clicked on duration, it would sort by duration. But if I want to go back and try to do the same analysis that I would do in Trace, where I would take the data that I captured and I want to aggregate based on statement to see what queries are running most often. If I tried to aggregate on statement, which I can do, I can right-click and I can say group by this column. And so it's going to group that data. And now you can see it's grouped by the statement. And at the end of each line, it's got a number, right? This is how many times each of those statements executed. That's great, but trying to go through this, especially from a production workload that's probably going to have a lot more rows, is not so fun. What I can do instead is I can go to that aggregation option here, and instead, excuse me, I don't want to aggregate, I want to group. Let's go to group, and instead of grouping on statement, let's move this out, I want to group on query hash. So we'll add this in, and now, once this does its job, check it out. I've got grouped on query hash. This is a lot easier to see, and I can immediately see, okay, this one ran 4,000 times. This one ran 13,000 times. Let's scroll up a little bit. Do I have any other heavy hitters? This one ran 8,000 times. So I immediately and very quickly can get an idea of what statements are running most often. If I expand, then I can look at the text and I can actually see what that text is. I've got the query hash, which I can then take, and I've got the query plan hash. I can then take that and I can go against the DMVs and I can pull up the plan for this query that is running over and over again and start my investigation there. So pretty straightforward example of what you can do with extended events. Same thing that you used to do in Trace, but how to do it within extended events. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip over and let Jonathan talk through a few slides, and we will then have a demo from Jonathan as well. And again, we're saving questions to the end, so hang tight. All right, John, flipping over to you.
Is my screen showing now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So Erin mentioned the system health event session a few times, and this is actually one of my favorite features behind extended events because it makes, as a consultant, it makes our jobs a lot easier to look at kind of the history. And 2012 really made a lot of great changes with the system health event session and the information that's available for it. It was implemented in conjunction with the product support group, and the purpose behind the system health event session is really to give you the system data that's necessary to troubleshoot performance issues or problems within the engine after they've happened. And it's in 2008, it's kind of funny that it uses an in-memory target, and typically when we're trying to do retroactive troubleshooting, it might have been after the instance failed or restarted or something happened to it, and if all the data was stored in memory, we lose it. So with 2012, there's actually a change to where it now uses a file target as well. And this is a session that is going to start automatically every time the database engine starts. And I get a lot of questions by email sometimes about, is there a performance overhead for this? And there's always a performance overhead for any kind of additional data collection that you have running, but this is very, very, very minimal, and it's not a event session that I would say you're going to gain any noticeable performance effect by turning it off. So it's something, hopefully by the time that I'm done going through what's in the system health session and how you can use some of that data in 2012 and higher, you'll actually want to keep that information available for diagnostic troubleshooting. So the big changes in SQL Server 2012, the addition of an event file target. It's going to maintain 4 separate rollover files that are 5 meg each. And this makes sure that the data is going to be available after an instance failure or restart. But there is a caveat there. If you're restarting an instance multiple times, every time you restart, it creates a new rollover file. So in the event that you've had a lot of restarts happening, you may not actually have the rollover information there. So that's something to keep in mind if you're trying to maintain diagnostic information. And they added a number of new events to the system health session so that you can diagnose more problems after they have occurred. Within it, excuse me, probably my favorite thing, it's even in 2008, was the addition of the XML deadlock reports. And if you've ever tried to use a system health event session in SQL 2008, you probably ran into a number of early release bugs that existed. I get emails all the time asking if there's an updated piece of code for one of the articles that I published online that had some workarounds for it, the bugs that existed. But in 2012 and higher, I have yet to run into a deadlock graph that couldn't be pulled from extended events with just standard XQuery or reading the file target files using the UI like Erin just showed. It also contains information about really high severity errors, anything that's above severity 20, or specific out-of-memory error states, CLR allocation failures, and then anytime a SQL OS ring buffer event is recorded to DMOS ring buffers, it actually has an event that gets written out to extended events in the system health event session as well. There's also information collected about weights and latches that are occurring in the engine, and probably the most useful component result that gets output into the files is the SP server diagnostic component output. And what this does is basically gives you a instance health check in 5-minute intervals. So it allows you to look back in time and see what the health status of the system, resource, query processing, and IO subsystem components were within SQL OS, and it gives you a lot more information for kind of retroactively looking at what was going on performance-wise with the instance when you weren't actually monitoring for it for further diagnosis. So what I'm going to do is flip over to my VM, and this is a set of code that I've used repeatedly, and what we're going to do is we're just going to look at the system health event session, and the best thing to do if you're trying to process with XQuery from my experience is to read the table valued function into a temporary table one time and then do all your XQuery off of the temporary table. I don't know the semantics for why, but if you're processing the events off of the table valued function for the file target itself, it just takes a lot longer to actually run through the information. So what I'm going to do is take a look at what events we have. This instance doesn't do a whole lot of interesting stuff. So the diagnostic information being collected by the system health session is a lot more limited, but we can still see we've got 5,356 SP server diagnostic component results. So we can go through and look at the system component and break down all the information about the system component outputs. And here we can see in 5-minute intervals we have a component result output. And if there was an issue, we might be able to spot it here. We can see what our SQL CPU utilization is, the overall system utilization. And this is going to be generated for every instance you have if you have multiple instances. And you could really start trending things and looking at, within 5-minute intervals, what's happening across each of the instances in the overall system. We can also go look at our resource utilization. And this is going to include two memory reports, one for our process or system memory counts, including the available physical memory, page file working set, and the other will be for the SQL OS Memory Manager and what the actual memory allocations are internally to SQL OS as well. And those are all going to be within the same 5-minute intervals, and we can see are we out of memory in any pool, are we getting any out of memory exceptions, and what our status is for the resources. Query processing also allows us to break this down, and we can see more details about how many workers have been created, how many are idle, do we have any block processes that exist, how many tasks have been pending or completed within our interval window for the monitoring, any information about our preemptive and non-preemptive weights, and then the last thing that you'll get here, if there was blocking, it will actually have the block process report information in the blocking tasks node. So you can see when there's blocking that's happening, you'll actually be able to retroactively go grab the block process report information from your system health event session. And that's something that's very useful sometimes for trying to figure out what was going on during a performance problem. So we can also break down our IO subsystem component and look for whether we had any long IOs within the interval, whether there are any pending IOs and any pending requests associated with those. So again, a lot of really useful information within the information collected by the System Health event session in SQL Server 2012 and higher. There's still a lot of good, useful information that will exist inside of 2008's event session, but it doesn't actually contain the SP Server diagnostics component result. That was a new implementation inside of SQL Server 2012. So if we go back to the slides, another thing that you can do, and Erin kind of touched on this earlier, is use extended events for actually performing replay captures. And this is something that was only very recently introduced by the updates that came out in April with RML utilities. And I actually got to spend a fair amount of time trading emails with some of the product support guys that worked on those tools, debugging a lot of issues with the trace conversion utility that is included in read trace. So if you have SQL Server 2012 and higher, all the events that are necessary to do a replay actually exist within extended events. But like Erin said, there's a big difference in the available columns. So you're going to have to add a lot of actions to the events to actually get the data that's required for doing replays using extended events as your capture source. So if we go to my other VM, so I've already installed RML utilities in this VM, and if you navigate to the samples file within the RML utilities folder, there's an exe trace capture definition script that will actually generate a extended events RML capture event session on the server. It adds all of the actions that are required to that event session, and then it will go down and start adding events. And there are a number of events that are required for read trace to be able to process the file. So you can run this script and just generate the event session as they provide it. But one of the things I would say is go into that event session, especially if you're looking to do this on a production server, and review the events that have been added to the event session. And make sure that they're all things that you want to have within your production server running. The reason I point that out is this one right here. And this is a pretty expensive event to have added to your replay trace. And you don't actually have to collect the post-execution show plan to be able to troubleshoot or perform replay operations. It's kind of there as a troubleshooting thing, and the script kind of lumps every possible event that you would need. This would be one that I would be very careful about having in a production environment, simply because it says right in the event, using this event can have a significant performance overhead. And in my testing, it can be anywhere from 20 to 30% of your throughput will go away just turning that one event on. So it can be a lot higher depending on the type of transactional workload that you have. So I try and kind of avoid that event. So I would say remove it, move it back over. And then basically you would start your replay capture. It's going to write to a file. And because of the time constraints, I already have a replay file that has been created right here. So what I'm going to do is we can go ahead and open this up, and it's just a example of the AdventureWorks Books Online workload that I've blogged out and used for a lot of different demonstrations and other purposes. And it's just a bunch of queries that run back against the AdventureWorks 2012 database. So we'll close that. And what we can do is we're going to have to drop to the command line to actually use read trace. But we can do read trace, specify our input file, and then our output location is to the RML path within our SQL Skills folder. And what it's going to do is it's going to go through, and this is all the trace to extended events mapping data that's being mapped out. And it outputs a lot of verbose information about what those mappings are. If you ever wanted to try and reverse engineer or figure out what events were necessary, you could do it there. But because I left certain command switches off, I removed them right before running that demo. It's going to actually load the data into a SQL Server database and then give us our performance analysis like we would with read trace for a trace file. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put those back. And the command line switches are the -F, -A, and then the -MS is what's going to allow us to, -F says not to do the analysis and performance data with reporter. -MS tells it to mirror out to a new trace file. So I'm going to actually let it process again, and it's not going to open the reporter application when it's done. It's just going to write the events down into a trace file, and once we have it written out to our trace file, which is here, we can now leverage distributed replay and pre-process that trace file. So D-replay pre-process, we're going to input our trace file, output our destination to our replay files. This takes just a second. And then once we've output our permissions, advanced, that's not good. Add advanced. Okay. That's the first. It won't let me actually go change the permissions on the file. So I just ran through all of this. But what I need to be able to do is give the distributed replay service account permissions to access the file. And I'm not sure why I can't change that permission here. But what we would do is we would pre-process the file, and then it will output the distributed replay files, or you could use ostress and process the RML files that were output by read trace as well. So there's two different ways that you could use extended events capture for replay operations. It's either RML utilities or through the distributed replay client. And because I've already processed this before, I can actually run the replay, and the replay controller should be able to work off of the existing distributed replay files from earlier today when I processed it through. And it's going to do the same replay operation that we would have gotten had we captured everything with trace. We're just kind of offsetting that overhead and allowing extended events to do the event capture for us, and reducing the performance effect to our production server. So while this is dispatching, it'll eventually start replaying the events back through, and that is essentially how you would go about doing distributed replay or any kind of replay operation through RML by using extended events. And the key thing is they provide a example capture definition to create what your capture definition would be for the event session. Just keep in mind that you might need to go back in and remove certain events because of their performance overhead. And I would always say test the event session with your typical workload before you ever put it on a production server. It could have a significant overhead for what you're actually doing. So with that, so extended events is the not-so-new event collection infrastructure in SQL Server. It's been around for a very long time, and I was really excited by it in 2008. And it does have some interesting things that you have to figure out how to do, like working with XML sometimes when you want to process files manually. But for the most part, the UI does a really good job, and it is the new replacement for SQL Trace. And it's incredibly flexible, allows you to create a lot of different complex configurations, and it gives you the ability to look at problems in ways that weren't ever possible with Trace. So it is the only method for doing diagnostic data collection for the new features that are coming out in SQL Server. They're not backporting events into Trace, and Trace has been deprecated since the 2012 release. So it's something that eventually everybody's going to have to figure out how to make use of. And hopefully the examples and real-world scenarios from this session have given you kind of a new look at extended events and an idea of how you might go about using things.
Okay. Well, I'm going to field the questions then that we had a bunch coming in. And the questions came in kind of in order for Erin, and then the later questions were for Jonathan. So I'll just start with the questions directed towards Erin. The first question was from John Kaufman. Are there good sources of template libraries to use as starting points?
There's a couple the templates that I think John blogged, and I did an insider video on how to create them. So if you're a SQL Skills Insider, or if you're not, you can still sign up and go back and view that. But John, I don't think there's a resource out there to view, is there?
For templates?
Yeah.
No. I mean, I have a ton of event sessions that I've blogged that with their purposes, but as far as excuse me.
That's okay. That's one of John's docs. So what I think where John's going is that there's sessions that he's blogged about that you could take that and turn it into a template. And the templates are a great starting point, but remember with extended events, you can create multiple event sessions and not have them active, right? So you're basically setting up the metadata, and then you start and stop those as needed.
Yeah, and I think templates, I know why Microsoft put the templates in, kind of so you have these standard configurations that you could share, and I've thought about creating more templates, but I've never really had a need to, so I never went down that road. I just kind of create event sessions as I need them, and having the scripts to generate the event session is no different than having the XML template to generate it. So I just always go back to the DDL.
Very good. Okay, the next question, also by John. John was a quite active question asker, so he was paying very close attention. Where can I find out which actions have a higher or lower overhead?
There's no documented list. Some of the events, like Jonathan mentioned, the show plan, note in the description that it's a higher overhead. But with regard to the actions, is that in your post that you did way back in your 31 days?
I know from my own experience which ones have higher overhead. Like create dump all threads, that's going to have a high overhead because it's performing a memory dump of every thread in the process. So probably don't use that one. That's more debugging or diagnostics with product support type stuff. But I mean, the actual overhead per action, it's not documented anywhere. Probably one of the most expensive ones that I can think of is the T-SQL stack, and its cost is going to depend on how many frames it has to unwind in that to generate the T-SQL stack level for you. And I've seen that have some performance implications where it does have a cost associated with it that when you remove it, you can see the difference in the event session performance. But aside from that, the events that would be problematic, they all have a description that says this event could affect performance. So,
right. And with regard to the action, sometimes it's also just how many, because the way that the process works within extended events is it pulls that default payload and it does the evaluation, and if it meets the predicate evaluation and it's an event that needs to be captured, then it goes and grabs the action. So at that point, how many is it? How many? Not just what the action is in the overhead, but how many does it have to go and get? So be judicious is sort of my general advice there. But otherwise, again, the ones that Jonathan mentioned, and it might take some testing to really determine the overhead. And Jonathan has a post that's out on SQL Performance that talks about the overhead of extended events compared to traits and the UI, the Profiler UI.
And I think that might go right into his next question, which he had 3 in a row, which does performance suffer with overly complex predicates, like, for instance, nested ORs? And
it depends on what the predicate's having to do. If you're predicating on the predicate source columns and it has to go pull additional information, that can have a performance impact because it has to make that method function call to go get that other piece of information. I always say write your predicates to fast fail because short circuit logic does work inside of extended events, which basically the first false evaluation of a logical block can allow it to short circuit the predicate evaluation entirely and preempt the event firing. So I try and write my predicates in the most restrictive manner possible to get them to fail faster, so I don't have to wait for the rest of the complex evaluation to happen.
Okay, let's see, the next question. This is from Joseph Hayes. In terms of performance, how do extended events compare to a server-side trace configured through Profiler? Server-side traces created with a script create less load than using the Profiler client live. Is there something similar with watching live data?
So everything in extended events is server-side except for when you do the view live data, the UI opens a streaming target against the event session that allows it to stream the data. And when it does that, it actually creates a secondary copy of the memory buffers that are shadow buffers internally, and those are what are serving that live data view. The big difference is if the live data view gets engine just says, okay, done, and disconnects the stream. So if it can't buffer the events out fast enough, it will just kick the stream reader off. And you can see a slight degradation in performance when that initial hit happens, but then it's going to kick it back out, and it goes back to all server-side processing again. And it's very hard to have the live view put a performance impact against the instance like you could with Profiler. That was one of the tests that I did for the trace versus extended events overhead analysis on SQLperformance.com.
Okay. There were a number of questions about the scripts being available. The slides are posted. I think that the scripts are going to somehow be available.
They are, yep. We'll send those over to PASS. I already checked, and they'll add them to the download for the PowerPoint.
Great.
So give us a little bit and give PASS a little bit of time to make that happen. But yes, Jonathan and I will get those scripts over, and they'll get them there.
Okay. From Tayyib Ali, can we adjust the default size of 5 megabytes and the number of files from 4 to a higher number?
Yes. All you have to do is go into the event session properties, and you can modify it, or you can just do it with the DDL. Pretty sure you're going to have to remove the event file from the event session and then add it back, though, in the UI. I believe you have to drop it and add it back from memory. But yes, it is possible to change that. The other thing is if you have the if you've ever dropped the system health event session, you can get it from the utables SQL file that's in the installation path. It's at the very bottom of that file. If you open that up, it has the drop and recreate command there, so you could also modify it inside of that file and redeploy the event session that way.
But in terms of the default, when you go to create a new extended event session, that's the value that it's defaulting to, the 5 and the 1. But you just have to change it, just to make sure that I got the original question.
Yes. Okay. I think that I'm trying to get through because there's a bunch of questions coming in.
Yep. There's another one that was just asked from Jerry. Is extended events a replacement for Trace and Profiler? Yes, absolutely. As John mentioned, they're not enhancing, improving Trace at all. Done. So anything that you were doing when you hit 2012 and higher, it's our recommendation that you start using extended events. If you're on 2008 R2 and below, then John and I in general say stick with Trace, stick with Profiler. But 2012 and higher, it's really time to shift over to extended events.
And I mean, as much as I try and use extended events, even in 2012, there are just cases where Trace is a little bit easier, and I go back to it. But for anything that I'm really trying to be low performance overhead diagnostics that might be running for a long period of time on a production system, I really look to extended event because of the difference in performance effect. Somebody,
Okay.
Richard Weiss, can the extended events output be saved directly into a SQL Server database? No. You can't do that because that was one of the slowest ways of, or one of the best ways to slow down a SQL Server in production was to have, basically that was a functionality of Profiler. It wasn't a functionality of Trace itself, because Profiler was reading the row set provider for Trace and then doing the inserts into a database table. And that's a very easy way to drop a server's performance by significant amounts. So it was not a part of the functionality that is in extended events. The only other part of Profiler that isn't implemented with extended events, I get asked about it all the time, is the ability to merge the extended events output with perfmon data. And that,
Right.
Unfortunately, in 2011, when I was getting a first preview of the UI, that was something that I believe Simon Sabin was with me at the time. He and I both asked about, and the UI guys had no idea that Trace could do that, or that Profiler could do that. And it was too far in the development cycle, and it's not something that I think we'll see in the UI for extended events, unfortunately.
Okay. So let's see. So that last one was the one from Jerry. Is that correct? So what, did you just answer the roadmap one for SQL Profiler? Is it going to be decommissioned?
I don't know. Probably at some point. I would expect that it would be, especially with extended events being implemented in analysis services now, but there's no UI that makes it easy to do with analysis services still. You still have to do it all through the XML. But you can read the files using the Management Studio UI. It's all the same file output. So I would guess that at some point, yeah, you'd see it decommissioned at the same time that Trace gets decommissioned. And the new UI is what is going to be its replacement.
Okay. Let's see. And then there was John Kaufman from the templates question at the beginning had a add-on. He said templates is the wrong term. Are there scripts to build out commonly needed sessions?
I mean, we have some that we'll share, and then there's a lot on John's blog, and I've got a couple on SQL Performance when I've done some performance testing. I'll use extended events there. So there's nothing on CodePlex. There's no particular library, but if you check out some of our blog posts, you'll get a good idea for starting. And I'll plug John's script, actually. If you are running SQL Server 2012 and higher, John has a script on his blog that you can download which converts an existing trace over to an extended event session. And that's typically how I teach this. So the first 20 minutes that I did was just kind of easing you into extended events, and I can spend, Mindy knows this, I can spend several hours just talking about that. And what I actually start with is a trace that's running, and then I take John's script, run that, and kudos to John for all the time he spent doing this, run that, and then it creates the extended events definition that I need there, because only in 2012 do you have all the events that exist in trace in extended events. So in 2008 and in 2008 R2, not every single event that you get in trace exists in extended events. That's only in 2012. So that script only works for 2012 going forward. But if you've got a bunch of traces that you typically run against your environment, you can create them and have them actively running, run the script, it'll create the extended events session definition, right, all the DDL, and then you can work from that.
Okay, and we are going to have time for just one more question because we are coming to the very end of our hour. And I think you just answered this one. So let's see, one that we can answer quickly. How about we're trying to capture baseline statistics so we can compare production today to a week ago, and we'd like to compare production to a performance test and non-production. That's not a quick question. I think that might need to be taken offline. How about this one? Will the PAL tool be upgraded to use extended events? That should be a quick answer.
The PAL tool doesn't have anything to do with trace or extended events. Right. It's just perfmon data that's being analyzed. So I would say no, just because of the way Clint Hoffman's designed that tool with the other guys at Microsoft.
Right, it's read trace that you want to use, which is part of RML util. So that works with extended events, and it also works with trace.
Okay, and then there was, I don't know if you can answer this or not, you can say that's too long. Can we replace extended events traces with a data collection data warehouse?
I know somebody has written a data collector for extended events. It's on, is it CodePlex? It's available on, I believe it's CodePlex is where it is. I can try and find the reference to it, and I'll either blog it or I'll tweet it. But somebody's already written a data collector integration for extended events for the data MDW. So it's not something you would have to roll your own on.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this presentation. We have another presentation coming up at the top of the hour. It's going to be on, wait a minute, I have it right here.
It's hopefully, it's spatial data.
Yes, on spatial data. Thank you. I was like, where did I put it? So please stay. I think you need to log out and log back in. I'm not sure if that's the case, but I take advantage of as many of these free sessions as you can. Great information. Thank you so much to our two presenters.
Thanks for having us.
And that's all.